Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is noon, so I can say good afternoon. Welcome to Schoodic Institute and our monthly brown bag lunch presentation. So we have a few folks here in the audience at Moore Auditorium, and we have more online with us out there in Zoom land. So again, I'm Nick Fisichella. I'm the president and CEO with Schoodic Institute. We are a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service and the Center for Inspiring Science, Learning, and Community for a Changing World. And we're really pleased to have Gale McCullough with us today to be talking specifically about seals.
And whales.
And whales, excellent. Yes, and identification of these wonderful marine mammals that we have here swimming just off of the coast. So thanks for coming again. Please check our calendar page for other upcoming events. We have the main outdoor film festival happening this Sunday evening out at the ball field on campus. Registration is through our calendar page. And then in a week and a half, we have the Halcyon String Quartet coming and performing here as well. So check that out again on our calendar page. Yes, so there was a question, do you have to pre-register for the film festival? The answer is yes. Yes. Yep, yeah, online. If you go to our calendar page at schoodicinstitute.org, you can scroll down and find the main outdoor film festival. There is a fee, a small fee to attend. And just so that we keep the numbers within our limits, registration is required. I think we may be able to take people at the door as well, but it'd be great if you register online beforehand. Yeah, be sure to get in. There are 11 short films by all different filmmakers about outdoor topics from across the country. We tried to hold it outside last year. Both of the days we tried, it rained last year. And so we had to do it online. We streamed it online, which worked out okay. Hopefully this year, the weather will cooperate with us and we can do it in person. All right, so thanks again, everybody, for being here. And Gale, take it away.
Okay. I call this Do I Know You? Because that's what I ended up trying to find out, if I knew individual seals and individual whales. Can you hear me okay? Okay, yeah, I guess I will. I wish I had a few more hands, but yep, go ahead. Take it.
There you go.
How's that? Yeah, okay. If you look at this picture, what do you see? You see two whales breaching simultaneously. And I just wondered when I saw this photograph, which was taken by Shelley Lonergan, who's from Briar Island Whale and Seabird Cruises in Briar Island, which is just across the bay from us, Fundy Bay. How did they time it so they both came up at the same time? Was there communication ahead of time? Did someone go 1, 2, 3, jump? Or why would they do that? And do they know each other? We do. Unfortunately, I don't have their names, but we do know who those were because they did fluke. But then when I looked at this slide, one of their eyes is right there. I'm not nearly as scared as I thought. The other one is right there. And it looks to me as if they're looking at each other. So not only did I want to know them, but they seem to know each other. Now the slide won't change. Huh. And I think what I'll do, that's the lights. Okay. Now I'm going, okay. And these are the two animals that have taken up the last 40 years of my life, pretty much. I loved animals as a child, and during my early adulthood in the 1960s, I became increasingly uneasy about the generic way they were considered and treated. I began to question the assumptions that were made about the scale and the ways that they had of measuring intelligence, with man placed at the top. It was back then in the 60s and 70s, there was a very graduated idea about intelligence amongst animals. Many of these measures were based on observations in laboratories or brief observations in the wild, neither of which allowed researchers a full picture of the natural behavior of an animal. We are learning it requires a long period of time spent over the several years following them in their natural habitats. The unfortunate thing about seeing animals as generic and thinking that they have no feelings, thoughts, memories, abilities to reason, gave us an excuse to do with them what we wished without any moral qualms. And I think that's been changing dramatically over the last 30 years or so. First of all, I worked with kids, and this is where it all began. Back in 1974, the dark ages, through 1978, I was teaching children in nursery school, and it was pretty, you know, they were human beings. We could identify them pretty easily. And so when I was taking my master's in early childhood education, we were taught to really do concentrated observations of children because some schools of education believe that you really needed to have curriculum developed around individual kids' needs, rather than just sort of curriculum that was coming from the state. I learned a method of observing when I was at Prospect School, which served me well later when I was working with seals and whales. And that was to take a line and draw it through the center of a page and have just the facts on one side, and then impressions and intuitions and the emotional, you know, and you can read those there, so that you got a sort of full picture of what the observer was observing. At the same time, I was reading Jane Goodall in the Shadow of Man. And I don't know how many of you read this, but Goodall used in-depth observations very similar to the ones I'd learned at Prospect. They were much the same as the kind of observations I did with my kids. She also learned to identify individuals, which must have been tough at first. And by doing so, she could differentiate personalities, document life histories, and understand their place in their society, and the interesting variety of ways that their temperament affected their lives. Some were experimenters with tools. They would use things to scoop out ants from logs and stuff like that. Some others had really good social skills. There were just a very different ways that individual chimpanzees operated as chimpanzees. It wasn't all just one way. She saw differences between her chimpanzees, much the way I saw differences between my children. She had one chimpanzee whose name was Flo. She was an extremely patient and really good mother, and she was getting older, so she would allow her the older siblings to sort of babysit for the younger ones, and as a result, she had a really cohesive social group amongst her own family, and that gave her a lot of stability within the larger group. And she was very successful, even though she was aging, and so were her youngsters. And then there was another female named Passion who was very impatient and rough with her children, her youngsters. She basically drove them away when she had another one. And she was also very aggressive against all the other chimpanzees in the group. And over time, she was shoved more and more to the side. And finally, she disappeared. I had two kids like that. One was named Hannah, and she was just very mild and quiet and shy, but she really drew other kids to her. She had a really nice way of being with kids. The other one was a girl named Melissa, who was very sort of nervous. You'd approach her and you could see her just kind of going, "Ugh," and she would say, I can do it. I can do it. You know, it's as if she really didn't want people to approach her. She was very standoffish. And she had a really hard time socially and also learning because she was constantly trying to find her place in the group. Well, one of the things that Goodall encouraged people to do is realize that you could really identify individual animals. If she could do it with chimpanzees, then it was particularly like skunks would be quite easy. Bears, not so much. Whales and seals, it took time, but for me, all the group on the left side there were animals that I could recognize in my observations. And if you look carefully, the seal at the top is the same as the seal at the bottom, and the seal in the middle is also the same as the other seal at the bottom. With whales, it took a while to really believe that they could identify by something, and it turned out to be the underside of their fluke. When they brought their fluke up to dive, humpbacks would have very different patterns underneath their fluke, as you can see. And how did whales enter my life when I was doing nursery school? I mean, and there was a real direct line between the school and moving over towards marine mammals. In 1976, which was when I was teaching, Jacques Cousteau was just beginning to bring up these beautiful images of humpback whales swimming in their natural environment. And the children were watching TV and they just wanted, what are those animals? I want to know more about them. And so there I was in Vermont trying to figure out how I could find out more about humpbacks. The only visual stuff that we had up until that point was whales that were beached. So there was this big bloated form on the beach, or whales that were on flensing boats, on the flensing deck of a whaling boat. That was what we sort of thought whales were these bloated, sad-looking creatures. And it wasn't until Cousteau that we knew differently. My kids were just really engrossed, and so were a lot of children at that age. And this is pretty amazing. Children began writing letters and sending cards and making drawings, and they sent them all to President Nixon at that time. It surprises me that Nixon was the one that wrote or that signed the Endangered Species Act and also the Marine Mammal Act. But they convinced him, amongst other people, to actually put those two acts into effect. Well, I didn't know where to get information. And fortunately, a friend of mine found this invitation to a whale symposium that was in Bloomington, Indiana in 1975. Its purpose was to bring together the few people. There were very few isolated biologists studying whales, and they were doing it mostly on whaling vessels. That was the only way they could get out to see them. But they were bringing, this symposium was meant to bring these two really isolated groups of scientists on the West Coast and on the East Coast together, but also to bring all kinds of other people who could show us more about whales, like cinematographers, like Cousteau, teachers like me, artists that could sort of do drawings that would give them details that they could really examine, artists of all kinds, musicians, and the few whale watch companies that were just starting to get going, which meant that more and more concerned citizens could actually start going out and seeing whales themselves. There was a strong sense of urgency at that point that if the whaling continued, the whales themselves might possibly disappear. One really fascinating thing that happened was Frank Watlington, who was a engineer that was placed on Bermuda to monitor for submarines, began picking up these songs of humpback whales, which you now, I'm sure all of you have heard them. They had no idea that they made these sounds. And he, combined with Roger Payne, began to realize that they were kind of songs, that they really had patterns and were very elaborate. So it showed that artists were just as important as scientists in trying to make a full picture and bring people in to what whales were all about. Also, there was an Earthwatch group. I don't know if you've heard of Earthwatch. It's a really neat organization that brings scientists together, and they come here, I think, with people who have particular interests. And so you can go and do, as a volunteer, research with a scientist and help them do their work and also get involved and see some pretty amazing stuff. And I found out that there was a berth on Regina Maris, which is the boat on the left. And so I volunteered for 2 weeks to go to some ledges that were north of the Dominican Republic. Silver Bank and Mouchoir Bank were the banks that they had just recently discovered that whales used for calving and for breeding. They didn't really know what the pattern of how they lived their lives. These were humpbacks in particular. And some of these same whales all of these whales would then migrate north during the summer months to feed. So they basically starved during that whole period between about November and March or April. And then they would come and feed like crazy up here. So when I got back, I added a lot of the ideas I'd just taken from all over, from being on the boats and also being at the symposium, and developed some curriculum to teach school kids about whales. And one of the big challenges was to teach them how big they are. So I made this big outline of a blue whale and had kids race from one end of it to the other, and they would be panting by the time they got to the end of that 100 feet, which is what blue whales end up being. And also see how many could fit in one of their eyes. We'd draw an eye in this outline, and we had 10 kids that would sit in could be able to stand in the eye. I visited other Vermont schools and did it with older kids. And finally, I took a group to do one of the first whale watches. I think that's where we are, going out of Portsmouth, and met again Steve Katona, who works at College of Atlantic, and was one of the many people that got the Allied Whale catalog together of individual humpbacks. And so I kept in touch with him while I was teaching. But then my all of the things that I'd experienced, it gave me a sense of the urgency of the plight of whales, and also a broader environmental sense of the dangers of what was going on. So I went to Antioch, New England, and took coursework in environmental education. And as it says there, in 1978, the classes at Antioch were already predicting global warming and the possibilities of species extinction that we are now experiencing. I mean, we've had a long time to do something. But it definitely alerted me to the urgency of protection and preservation, which I really wasn't that aware of at that point. So I got a job in Kennebunkport at SALT Institute. And I don't know if any of you have heard of SALT Institute, but anyway, they had a group of vocational rehabilitation students from the high school in Kennebunk and Biddeford. And I was teaching an environmental education an environmental course within that program. And I was, okay, and I was looking for places to take these kids to all the time. And at some point, a lobsterman came up to me and recommended this particular haul out that he knew about that was very close to home. It was just a few feet away. Instead of having to go miles out to study whales, there was a possibility of just walking out my back door and sort of, and seeing them there. The SALT program ended, and I wanted to stay involved with the marine mammals that I'd become so fascinated with, and decided to continue observing on my own. And that began an 8-year project in Kennebunkport. That was only the beginning, though. Let me describe this photo a little bit. This is a low tide ledge, and it's facing the ocean, the open ocean. These were the winter rocks. Yep, these are the winter rocks. I would come out here and sit on a rock, and then in front of me was a boulder that was kind of like a blind. Sometimes the seals would haul out there, but mostly from September through May, they would haul out along here on the winter rocks. And then they would shift over to these rocks in the summer, which was a mystery to me, but that happened all the 8 years I was there. I began to think that the winter rocks themselves were used as protection from the open ocean, because the storms would come in really powerfully there. It just faced south. So, and then when it was a gentler season, they could move to the summer rocks that were much less rocky and hard to get up onto. I'm sure a lot of people don't really understand what haul out means, and I'll describe it. It's not hauling your traps like lobstermen do, but seals, because they're both land and water-based, use rocks as a place to rest and also get away from predators, both land predators and water predators. And so they will haul themselves out onto these rocks. And it's quite tedious. It's not an easy thing to do. Text first. Okay. Over time, I could recognize individuals. And this one is a male named Honcho, who I saw 50% of the time when I went out there. So he was pretty loyal to that set of rocks. There were, what I began to see over time, there seemed to be a group that was a local group that I would see at least a few times every month of the year over that period, over that 8-year period. Then there were what I called the tourists, seals that I would see every year, but in a unregular basis. Sometimes they come in the spring, sometimes in the fall, sometimes on and off all through the year. And then there were these transient males that would come, and I'll talk about them in a minute. This is also another local, BB2. And if you read the sideline, it tells you about that wound on her belly. This is Stevie Wonder, who turns out to be female. And the reason I called her that, she has cataracts in both eyes, so she's blind. And when she was bottling, which is when they are in the water with just their head sticking up, she would move her head the way Stevie Wonder did for sound, I think, so she could hear everything that was around her since she couldn't see. She did really well. She had 2 pups. She was she was pretty paranoid because she wanted to make sure she had her space. But she, interestingly enough, was the one that seemed to lead the group from the winter rocks to the summer rocks. She'd be there by herself at first, and then the others would join her later. And these are some other local females, mostly youngsters. The one on the left, I think, was a contemporary maybe of Stevie Wonder's. Then this is that weird fall male group, which I called the truckers, because they would come through, as you can see on that very primitive graph that I made, that they were only there from October through December. This group, sometimes all together, but then once they kind of coalesced, would always arrive for at least 3 years that I was watching, and haul out only until December, and then they disappear and come back the next year. And I don't know what that was about. I'm not sure why locals and tourists exist, for example, because, but I suspect it depends on their fishing styles. There might be some individuals that had a really dependable feeding place that was close to that set of rocks. And so they just take a trip out and come back and take a trip out. Others might have ranged much further to get feed. And so they would come and go according to how far out they'd gone in the ocean to find food. I mean, food was sort of a determining factor in all ways. Oop. I think, yes. In 1988, I moved to Hancock, which is very close to here. It's a couple of bays over, and started studying a ledge there. It was very different from the other one. It was a high tide ledge. So the seals would haul out. How does it work? The water had to come in to a certain height because it was all mud flats around the rock. They would come and haul out on the ledge and stay on it, sort of moving up the ledge until the water started going back out again. And then they would leave as soon as they could to miss getting stuck in the mud, because that was basically all was there. It would just empty, that bay would just empty out. It was very protected, and it seemed to be mostly a pupping ledge, and it seemed to be used mostly by females. So, and I did recognize individuals. This is one about the first drawing that I made, because I didn't have good photographic equipment, and that's Orion, who is also the same one that's below. And I saw her all of the time I was there, from 1988 through 2014. This is Tess, another female, and you can see there's sort of a T on her throat. So I tried to find some marking and then name them in a way that would remind me of what marking I was looking for. This was Marvin, who was the seal that I'd seen as a pup, and the others I didn't see soon enough. I didn't see them when they were pups. And she had her first pup when 5 years after I first saw her. So that sort of gave me the feeling, and it's also scientifically known, that she became mature at 5 years. I don't think she was doing very well. You can see her hip bones, not the bones, but this big lump where her hip is. She should look like a torpedo. But I think this was after she'd had a pup, and the strain of the rich milk she had to give this pup was really hard on her. Oh. Okay. And then this is Thallow, which is really interesting. She had really tiny flippers, and she was doing okay. She raised 2 pups successfully. But if you look at on the lower left corner, the seal on the top has normal flippers, and then hers are very small. And then these are some more females. It was really neat, this bay, because it was full of other life as well. And there was an eagle nest that was in gliding distance from the rocks. And the eagle never killed pups that I saw, although they have been known to. But they would eat pups that had died, but they seemed mostly interested in the placenta. And they'd sort of clean up after the births, carrying off what looks like a red T-shirt. Well, now just some thoughts about what was different about these 2 ledges, and it was very interesting to have done them both. Kennebunkport was, I think, more of a home base kind of ledge, and there were several that were adjacent along the shore, but some individuals seemed to find that this one was one that they preferred, so they would use it more often. Whereas the Hancock ledge, I think, was the one that's the lower photograph, and the one that was in a cove, was sort of more supplemental. Individuals may have used it some other ledges at low tide that were nearby. And then if they just wanted to feed their pup more, or they wanted to rest more, they would just drop in and use this ledge, but it wasn't the primary ledge for them. All this time, I was still staying in touch with allied whale. Peter Stevick had helped me set up the seal study. Steve Katona was sending me scouting for new research areas like Briar Island and also Grand Manan. I began to see that there were a lot of whales that used those areas pretty heavily in the summer months. And I also was a naturalist on a whale watch boat and helped in 1986 and 1987 when I was in Kennebunkport, and also helped do whale matching when I came up here from 1990 through 2008. I helped match helped the humpback whale catalog grow. And this is really interesting. This was the catalog when I first got here. And now there are 8,000 to 9,000 whales in the catalog, and it's huge, and it's on computers and really hard to manage, but they're doing an amazing job. When I was a naturalist, I kept in touch with Steve Katona, and I contributed my photos from our whale watch boats. You could see a lot of the boats really look just like made over lobster boats. Some of them, I don't know how they stayed upright. And then, as I showed you, that the catalog was really tiny at that point. So sometimes I would be sending in a whale that hadn't been cataloged. It was really a fun time. It's kind of the cowboy days of whale watching. In order to deal with the growing catalog, they tried to separate out the kinds of flukes from type 1 to type 5. So an almost white fluke, if you got one in the mail from somebody and they wanted you to identify it, you'd look to see which type it was and then just go through that particular catalog. I've put this as a tribute to Carol Carlson, who was one of the first people that had faith in the fact that there was a stable identifying feature to humpback whales. And she knew that the fluke, the underside of the fluke, stayed the same from year to year. She was really very important. Then the internet opened up all kinds of possibilities for collaboration, it seemed, amongst whale devotees and naturalists as well as scientists. I was a member of Flickr, which was an early photographic website, and I was intrigued by photos that kept coming into my view of whales and of people who were like-minded in their enjoyment of whales. And so on a whim, I typed in humpback whale and fluke in the Flickr search engine, and hundreds of photographs popped up. Some were excellent, some were not. But this was one that was particularly amazing, and that I was working on the Southern Ocean catalog at that point. This is a whale that was cataloged in Brazil by a research group there in 1999. And this is a whale that was seen by a tourist named Freddie Johansson. He was out bird watching and just on a whim went on a whale watch trip. And again, just on a whim, even though it was embarrassing to him, photograph of this whale, posted it on Flickr, and I matched it. And so we found this whale that had been in Brazil in 1999 and in Madagascar in 2001, and she traveled 6,000 miles in 2 years. Now they're finding this a lot, but this was one of the first times that they realized that whales could travel huge distances, and you could never really tell where you're going to see them next. They're pretty organized about how they use the ocean, but there's some real surprises. So I started my own collection in Flickr, and this was all. I would only take photographs that people accept photographs that people were willing to share, and there were some wonderful ones that were just taken by photographers that went out on a whale watch. And then I've made a collection of them and set it up much the same. You can see up there in the upper right is the type 1s, type 2s, type 3, type 4, type 5. So just if anyone want to go whale watching and wanted to find out who they had seen, they could use this to match. And sort of instantaneously, it's nowhere near like the official catalogs that the Center for Coastal Studies and Analog will have, but it's just a collection from, it was citizen scientists. It was a real example of citizen science. And it's still going today. I also, once Facebook became really hot stuff, started a group that made it possible for people to post a whale that they just seen. And sometimes instantaneously, someone would come on and say, oh, that's Colt, or that's some known whale. And they could just very quickly find out who it was. And usually it was, I mean, we made sure that the person that identified it was good at it. So that was pretty neat that people could do that. Come on. Nope, I guess I have to click it again. So all eyes are needed. It's really expensive to do whale research as a scientist. You know, you pay thousands and thousands to go out there. You can stay for a week or so, but you have to have all your food. It's very complicated. And so it's very difficult to get a lot of information coming in. And what seems to be an amazing resource is whale watch boats who we all pay for when we go out. There are some amazing naturalists like Shelley Lonergan, who is at Briar Island. And I've just put these two because these are both north of the Gulf of Maine. It's the Bay of Fundy and the northern waters of the Gulf of Maine. So they're our neighbors. That's Bar Harbor Whale Watch on the right. And Julie Taylor is the head naturalist, and Hugh Navarro and several others are naturalists on that boat. And they know a lot. When you go out there, there's just enormous amounts of information they can give you. And then you also need hardcore devotees like me, and that's my family. We went out in Briar Island on a Zodiac with Jamie, who's the guy on the far right. And it was really amazing. And I brought back photographs and observations that I had seen. And if no one else had seen that stuff, I could contribute that. I mean, we are important. People who care about whales are really important, as are just the casual first-time whale watcher who's not really sure what they're looking at and has a bird land on their head because it's fall and they are hitching a ride. I mean, it's a grand adventure for them, but sooner or later, a lot of them become devotees. They graduate. Okay, I don't want to, I mean, I'm running out of time, so I'll be really fast about this, but these are two stories that just, when you know an individual and when you spend a lot of time out there, there are stories that come that make you wonder about, there's a lot more than just the facts. And so now you're sort of on the other side of my observation sheet, where you're just sort of trying to figure out what they're doing and why and who's involved. This is two known females, Raindrop and Assay, and that is like a 20-foot long rack island that they're just woozling in. These are two 50-foot whales. Somehow they both fit in this, and they both collaborate their motions in this very tiny rack space. They drape the rack over their heads. They put it up on their flippers and flipped it around. It was just wonderful to watch. They're playing, right? I mean, what else could you? It felt good, I think. And this is one that's very important to me. Oh, I'm going to skip this one. It's a great one, but I don't want to take too much time. This is Fissure, who was a young whale that I saw in 1986. I knew it was 2 years old, and I knew its mother was a whale named Vale. And he would often meet our boat when we came out to Jeffrey's Ledge, which was 20 miles offshore. he would spy hop, and then he would go underneath the boat and come up on the other side. And then he'd go back underneath the boat and blow that big bubble and come up under it and look at us. And then he'd go underneath the boat and come up on the other side. And I think he just liked hearing the sound that was going back and forth across the deck. Who else knows? But one time we'd been watching for a while, and if you're sideways to the waves, which you usually are when you're just standing there watching something, the boat's going like this. And this woman got really seasick and went to the stern and was puking over the side. When all of a sudden, when I went to check her, all of a sudden I saw her stand up really straight. And it was like, we both looked down and you can see those big white flippers. It's green, and this wonderful green underwater. And this whale was coming up right underneath us. I mean, its rostrum could have touched the stern of the boat, right underneath us. And just like, well, come on, what are you doing back here? And she was fine after that. So this is the last one. We need to protect these whales again. I didn't mean to make this emotional, but they're getting entangled. Global warming is affecting the ocean temperatures. So the feed supply is getting less. We need to know them while we can. There is time for questions, and I would love questions. I was hoping I could make it shorter so there could be more. Yes. Individuals, then from that you learn things like Jane Goodall did with social patterns. Yes. How do we? What more can we know about social structure and that kind of stuff from knowing individuals the way Jane Goodall did? Is that close? Yeah. It's hard because you're in the ocean. You're looking at this incredible creature that is 3/4 of the time out of sight. So you have to kind of guess what's going on. And a lot of times they're beginning to think that certain individual humpbacks hang out together quite a bit. And sometimes certain individual humpbacks hang out together at certain times. Like when the migration is starting toward the south, it seems like clumps come together at that point. But it's really hard to know if two whales 2 miles apart aren't a group, that they may be able, like all those boats that are out there, they might be communicating to each other underwater, the way the lobstermen are talking to each other on the horn. So it's really hard to know. And it's hard to figure out how to make a real cohesive study of how that works. So I would love to know more about that. But that's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. Is there a similar organization like Allied Whale for Harbor Salt? No. And I'm not so sure there's a lot of effort going into, there is some, and again, it could be the citizen scientist who's going to do this. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of information about long-term study of individual seals that I know of, and I hope there is sometime soon. And if you ever hear of it, I've got tons of stuff to contribute. Yeah. How old do these whales get to be? It's getting close. I mean, we have a whole group of whales that we saw in 1976 who are still around. So we have a real some that we actually know the age of. Other than that, not really. There was a bowhead whale in the Bering Sea that had a, I don't know how it worked. It had the head of some sort of weapon that was only used 200 years ago, embedded in some of its bone structures. So they think, maybe that is how old some whales can be. Yeah. But it's very hard to tell. They don't have tree rings it would be nice, but they don't. And baleen whales don't have teeth. So you can't really, there's no way of, maybe orcas, you could do that with toothed whales, but not so easily with, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a healthy middle-aged whale. Yeah. Yeah. Migration patterns of whales? Of whales. Yes, the one I think I rushed through it, so you probably didn't get it, but there's a very steady one of migrating from the feeding grounds, which are up here. They arrive here in about May, and then they end up in the Caribbean, in various places in the Caribbean in November. So that's a very common migration pattern that happens every year. And they know a lot of whales at both ends. There are a lot of whales they've seen down there and also seen up here. So that pattern is pretty well known. I don't know what was going on with that whale that went from Madagascar to Brazil. I mean, what was up with her? So yeah, I think they have a lot of information now about migration patterns, and knowing individuals helps. Any more? Mary. Racking. It's my term. So you wouldn't necessarily know it. It's when a whale starts playing around in the rack, which is that floating seaweed island that, yeah. Woozling too, that's another of my terms. And that's what seals do a lot. Two of them will come up and just start going around each other, nose to nose and stuff. Yes. No, these are humpbacks that I'm showing you. There is an orca that lives in the Gulf of Maine named Thom, who's all by himself. He has a really large, but I think further north of us there are more orcas. But we have right whales, we have finback whales, we have minkies, we have a lot of toothed whales, dolphins, Atlantic white-sided dolphins, and harbor porpoise, and that, yeah. So it's similar. We don't have gray whales. There's no gray whales here. We have walrus. One walrus. Well, I guess Ireland is where he is right now. Any more?